discussion. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Katherine. Deborah, Leonie, excuse me. I don't know if one of you has a preference for going first, but one of you are welcome to take it away.
Shall I just go ahead?
Yes, I think I actually have to rejoin the meeting.
Brilliant, thank you. Okay, so I'll try and keep to time. I should say that I think my comments are also entirely sympathetic to Katherine Hawley's paper, which I thought was a wonderful paper when I first read it, and has caused me to have a lot of thoughts since then. And that's why I was very grateful to have the chance to talk about this here. So my account is really asking questions about the scope of imposter syndrome and what it should or shouldn't include. And if there's time, I will make some suggestions about what I think about that. But in particular, I want to draw attention to a certain kind of aspect of feeling like an imposter that might perhaps be sometimes included and sometimes excluded in the popular and psychological definitions of imposter syndrome. So on Hawley's account of imposter syndrome, it's one in which imposter syndrome involves negative attitudes to one's own performance or skill. So specifically, these attitudes might involve a mistaken lack of belief in one's own adequacy, but they generally reflect an internal subjective assessment of your own level of competency, either in absolute or relative terms, whether you think you should have those beliefs or not, with the industry or the role that you find yourself in. And it's Hawley's assessment that a useful and I think ameliorative concept, the scope of imposter syndrome, ought to focus on reducing those imposter attitudes, so reducing the amount of mistaken beliefs around competence. And this goal requires focusing then on the content of those doxastic beliefs themselves. It might be achieved in various ways, and it might be true whether or not those beliefs are rationally justified or not. So Hawley again talks about this broad scope or the narrow scope of this, this syndrome. And I think that this is a sensible way to think about one of the goals that we might have in trying to alleviate imposter syndrome when it comes to competence. However, as Hawley also notes from the beginning and alluded to at the end of her talk today, these doxastic attitudes or beliefs are also typically associated with affective attitudes, such as an anxious fear of being found out or of being unmasked in what Hawley describes as a kind of moral humiliation. So specifically, anxiety, fear, a sense of being a fraud, a perception of incompetence, feelings of inadequacy leading to self-doubt and certain behavioural performances might regularly accompany the doxastic states that we have when we have imposter attitudes. She just suggests that these doxastic states and affective attitudes could come apart, and actually spends a bit of time later in the paper talking about instances in which the imposter attitudes might be present without the affective attitudes, which is in itself quite an interesting consideration. But the fact that these two things can come apart also leaves on the possibility, as Katherine just suggested at the end of her talk, and I quote this from her paper now, so that perhaps there could be a sufferer from imposter syndrome who believes that she is skillful and successful, yet still has high levels of anxiety of a type more appropriate to someone who lacks such beliefs. And this possibility is also echoed in Shanna Slank's paper on imposter syndrome, when she gives an initial definition, which I think interestingly seems to exclude that the person must believe that she doesn't deserve her success. So from Slank's paper, just to quote briefly, she says, roughly, imposter phenomenon is the phenomenon of feeling like a fraud and believing that you don't belong. Now, she immediately goes on to add, if you experience it, then you experience your success as not really yours. But I'm quite intrigued by the possibility of that first definition that she gives there. So beyond, oh, this is my Zoom thing going mad. Beyond the thought that we might have that quote from Hawley, but the focus in Hawley's paper on the source and status of mistaken beliefs about competency in paradigm cases quite naturally doesn't direct her in that paper to consider those cases in which the doxastic state is absent while the affective state is present. But I would like to suggest, perhaps in the comments today, that by actually paying attention to cases where the affective states are present, but the apparent doxastic attitudes relating to competence are not, we might learn more about what the full range of doxastic states imposter syndrome does or should include ought to be. Certainly if we're interested in an ameliorative project, depending on who the we is that's looking at this. And in particular, I think that we can identify either that there are a range of alternative imposter attitudes and beliefs that ought to be included, or we'll come to the conclusion that a number of cases that are currently presented as being imposter syndrome or included when people talk about imposter syndrome, both in the literature and through self-identification, ought not to be categorized in this way at all. And this could sort of arm us with a new powerful conceptual tool if we can do something with this. It could be a useful hermeneutical resource with which to challenge structures that marginalize certain groups in particular. Now, I mean, before I sort of ask this question, I think one thing you might ask is why ask it at all? Because before we get started, what you might think at first blush is that it sounds a bit odd. Of course, people can experience anxiety, fear, and a whole load of things like self-doubt, and they might have absolutely nothing to do with being an imposter. They might turn up in all kinds of situations in our day-to-day life. So why tie this to an examination of imposter syndrome at all? And I think really there are two reasons for doing this, or I can come up with two reasons why I'm drawn to doing this. The first is that the kind of moral humiliation that Katherine Hawley encourages us to consider as a regular byproduct of imposter syndrome is, I think, very inextricably tied to being a member of a marginalised group within settings in which one's intellect or intellectual ability are the loci for success, regardless of beliefs about competence. So examining cases in academia in particular, in which people experience anxiety, self-doubt, over-preparing, procrastination, fear, shame, worries about being found out, and actually I would add feelings of anger towards the industry that makes you feel this way, might actually lead us to reevaluate the scope of imposter syndrome itself, but also reconsider its suitability for describing the cases. And second, I think that if we look at the looser definition that Slank very briefly gave in her kind of conceptualization of it, but also if we look at the kinds of groups that often have taken hold of the concept of imposter syndrome as something that they feel it belongs to them, there are two sets of beliefs that seem to be in there. And these are, first, believing that one is a fraud, that one is incompetent in some way, and second, believing that one does not belong. And I actually think these sets of beliefs are distinct, but they often seem to come together when we talk about imposter syndrome. So not necessarily in Hawley's paper, where she's very clear about what's going on there in terms of competence, but it certainly seems to be in part of the common conception. And now we all know that academia, and I have to say I know far less about the German environment than I do about the UK environment, but it comes with an almost laughable level of imposter feelings. So as Katherine sort of alluded to earlier, if you bring together high achievers, constantly criticise them, and then make them display their intellectual competence without much praise, that's not going to really lead to outcomes in which people feel fantastic about themselves. And if I had more time, I'd say more about imposter environments. But the mistaken beliefs that one's not good enough, and the beliefs that you might well be good enough or better than what is actually needed, but that you don't know how to play the game or how to get invited to play the game, or even what the game is, these are two distinct sets of beliefs, both of which are experienced by marginalised groups, I think, in particular. And certainly within academia, which is the case that I'm thinking about today. And in both cases, we might feel the constant anxiety and fear of being found out or thrown out, but there's something distinctive between them. So this feeling that you don't belong, that you don't fit in, can lead to the same affective states of anxiety, fear, and feelings that we typically associate with feeling inadequate, even when the individual feels entirely competent, but they come together in the same environment. And these feelings are, in psychological assessments and questionnaires, often used as evidence of imposter syndrome. So you've kind of got this connection between them. So ultimately, we've got two different sets of doxastic states, I think, and one set of very similar affective attitudes, both regularly tied together in the psychological and popular conception of imposter syndrome. And I actually think that's a problem. And I'll try and say a bit about why I think that's a problem. So my examples come from thinking about the working class academic and their experience in academia. And it's not a surprise that my examples come from this arena, because this is my own background. And so this is something that I have some experience of. But it's also something that's written about quite a bit in the literature. So if we consider the working class academic experience, working class academics often come to academia as Bordeaux's miracles, the ones who've escaped their backgrounds in some way and risen to the top to academic success. And we as working class academics, or at least the ones who make it, and honestly most don't, are held up as success stories. But for many of us, being working class in academia is a disjointed and difficult experience. We arrive without knowledge of how things work in terms of the system, but also in terms of the social and cultural capital of the industry and how that goes along, because it's an industry certainly dominated in the UK environment that I'm within by a middle class culture. And so if you look at Colaco's work in 2014, 2012 about the differences in academic culture in working class homes and middle class homes, you see this distinction. And so we often have a different sense coming here as working class academics of cultural and social capital. And it's one we don't necessarily want to lose, but it's not one that's particularly valued in the industry we find ourselves in. So Annabelle Wilson, Dan Ray, Kirsty Morin, and Jessica Abrahams, in a paper in 2020, who were all working class academics at various stages of their career, from PhD to senior professor, discussed their experience of being working class academics in academia, and you can see that on the screen there. The notion of having to give up part of yourself, they say, is something that all of us have experienced during our time in academia. This is found in negotiations of how to present yourself in person, on social media, how to dress and how to talk, accent and pace. We're often painfully aware of the need to constantly manage ourselves in order to try and fit in the context of higher education. New discomforts have also arisen in some of the taken for granted activities of academia. These dislocations of environment and prior experience have been scattered and inconsistent, but they're also present and consolidate a feeling of being outside of the norm. And so as an academic from a working class background, you can come into this industry almost pre-designed not to fit in some way. And speaking for myself, as somebody with a complicated relationship to academic success, these are feelings that I well recognize. And so this sense of being no longer what you were, but also certainly not what some people believe you've become, is quite common. And so you can consider this account from one working class academic who's cited in that paper by Wilson. She says, I reminisce fondly of the excited, passionate, intelligent girl I was when I arrived, and how a series of events, microaggressions, I guess, have left me afraid to participate. I feel undervalued, used and excluded. I want to fight, but the Academy's power over me is great. It has ground me down and made me vulnerable. And what you get a sense of here is not somebody who feels that they lack competence, they're excited, they're intelligent, they care about this work, they're interested, but somebody who feels all of those, starts to feel all of those feelings of anxiety and self-doubt and worrying about the work and getting into that kind of pattern. So the question I think this leaves us with, and I'll try and get through this as quickly as I can, is, are the effective experiences of marginalized groups that are associated to these kinds of doxastic states, these kinds of beliefs about not belonging, which quite clearly will often be justified as well, they're not necessarily unjustified at all, are the instances of imposter syndrome, or should we exclude them from our taxonomy altogether? And I think you're sort of left with two main categories of options here. So on the one hand, we might think that there's no real distinction to be made. So we might focus on these affective states, and we might think, rather than creating a situation in which potentially only the privileged might end up being marked out as truly experiencing imposter syndrome, because all working class academics might come into this environment in this way, we should actually reclaim imposter syndrome, either to include a wider range of doxastic states or for its effective attitudes and impacts. And this might lead us to reach one of two sort of conclusions, depending on how we're drawn to thinking about imposter syndrome. First, that doxastic states are primary, but that we should include imposterism about competence and imposterism about fitting inness, so something like that. Or that we just ought to focus on the affective states themselves and just say, if you've got these feelings, that that's what we should be looking at, and we're trying to alleviate those feelings, as Sarah Paul suggests in her response paper to Katherine Hawley. And why do this? Well, we might think, for example, as the author Natalie Ola suggests, that far from being the product of a pathology, what seems more likely is that imposter syndrome is a natural reaction of anyone from a working class, disadvantaged or minority background to the various biases they experience on a daily basis. So that's one way we could go. But the other way we could go, and the way I actually think we should go, and I don't think I have time to say why, but on the other hand, we might want to mark out the distinction between the states produced between feeling that you don't belong and feeling that you're not competent in some way. So Wilson and I do make the point in relation to experience of being working class academia. They say that there probably aren't too many individuals who feel at ease with every aspect of the academy. However, there are powerful and effective class-based experiences, particularly when you've been and become upwardly socially mobile. And here we have Ross Clare, who's a lecturer in classics and ancient history at Liverpool, a working class academic, saying, I've entertained the possibility I'm just not good enough. Extreme imposter syndrome can never truly be exorcised from the soul of a working class academic, but I think instead it's because of the strange, unique contradiction inherent in academic success for working class academics. And so on this account, we might think that doxastic states are in fact the source of imposter syndrome, but that within that set, we ought to, as Hawley has done originally, stay focused on competence, not belonging, which would leave us free to mark off the remainder as something else. And if we're interested in a ameliorative project, that might be the way to go, precisely because the kinds of things we might want to do to reduce mistaken beliefs of competence might be very different to what we want to say when we have whole groups of people who have beliefs about not fitting in, which are very likely to be justified. My time's up, so I'm going to finish there, but thank you very much, and thank you, Katherine, for the paper and the chance to think about this.
Katherine, would you prefer to respond to that now, or would you like to respond to both?
Why don't we go on and I'll respond to both, because there may be some common points. Or yeah, thank you.
All right, Deb, please.
Can you hear me now? Is the sound okay? Okay. If there's any issue, let me know and I can join on my phone, because we currently have a bit of a weather warning in the southwest of England. So the internet connection might be bad as a result. I'm not quite sure. So my comments, as I was saying, are really sympathetic, because I really loved Katherine's paper when I first heard about it and first read it last year when it came out. And I have just some comments that are more suggestions and kind of requests for clarifications about some things that are suggested in the paper, but I think could be maybe expanded on. And then, so I'll just start with summarizing the key ideas of the paper. So there are a couple of different kinds of questions that Katherine deals with in the full paper, which weren't maybe touched on today. So there's the question of what is imposter syndrome, which is of really broad relevance, I think, in academia, and I think particularly in my own experience of academia. There's a distinction that Katherine makes, which I thought was really interesting, between imposter syndrome and the kinds of attitudes involved in imposter syndrome, which are what she calls imposter attitudes, which are negative attitudes to one's own performance or skill. That's a little bit of an oversimplification of how she describes these, but I thought it was quite nice, because that allows her to then investigate first, what is the content of imposter attitudes, what is the nature of imposter attitudes, and what are associated attitudes which might surround those imposter attitudes that she focuses on. So whilst Katherine focuses primarily on imposter attitudes, she talks about other surrounding attitudes, such as the lack of belief in one's own adequacy, the fear of being found out, and maybe sometimes the moral guilt of being an imposter and carrying on as an imposter in various domains. So I thought those questions were really nicely laid out, and the way that Katherine distinguishes between various options is very informative. And she goes on trying to assess how do imposter attitudes relate to imposter syndrome. So there's a standard assumption, and I'm going to highlight this one because it's the one that I'm particularly interested in, that Katherine criticizes. So there's the standard assumption that imposter syndrome involves attitudes which are not well supported by evidence. So there's this assumption that sufferers of imposter syndrome are not justified in doubting themselves. And Katherine sheds serious doubts on this assumption and aims to show that justified but false imposter attitudes are in fact widespread, and so should be maybe considered at least as something that we might be willing to include in the concept. I thought that was really interesting, and it raised some good questions about what kind of justification is involved in those imposter attitudes. And I'll kind of highlight that in a little bit. So there are different kinds of arguments and consideration that Katherine raises for why externally successful and talented people might nevertheless reasonably doubt themselves, what makes their beliefs, their imposter attitudes, the narcissistic imposter attitudes, nevertheless justified. And partly, as Katherine really made clear in her talk, that comes from there being a sort of separation between what evidence the subject that is prey to imposter syndrome has gotten from formal markers and the kind of evidence that the subject gets from their environment. So Katherine rightly said, none of us is justified in forming firm beliefs about our capabilities on the basis of those formal markers alone, but these actually need to be bolstered by ongoing wider evidence. So there are various kinds of markers that will generate some conflict between the markers of success that seem to be making the beliefs, the imposter attitudes just unjustified, and the actual evidence that the subject is getting from their environment. So for example, different responses to the same quality of work, some women or other minority in academia work might be judged a little bit more harshly, or success might be attributed to maybe various policies. I thought that was quite an interesting example in the discussion of the policies that are currently being in academia. And so those are rebuting and undercutting defeaters. There might be a play of unfairly high standards and stereotype traits leading to difficulty in judging capability by performance under stress. People might fail to understand informal feedback because they're not quite used to that kind of environment. And Katherine also highlights the role that pragmatic encroachment might play in leading people to have varying epistemic standards for justified beliefs. So in particular, when people suffer from imposter syndrome, there's a link in the high anxiety that might be tied to fear of failure, because they might really need to succeed in an exam to get the job that they want, as opposed to someone who is coming from a slightly easier background and has a sort of net to kind of support themselves in case they don't get the job or they fail the exam that will lead to them getting the job.
I think we lost Deb.
Has she dropped off the Zoom call? I don't think I see her anywhere.
Now she's joining again, but let's see.
Is this better? Can you hear me better?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, where did it stop? I've just rejoined from my phone.
I think you just mentioned pragmatic encroachment, so around there.
Okay, great. So I'll just keep going from there then. So yeah, Katherine then moves on from this to exploring whether we should include just people who have justified the false imposter attitudes as under the definition of people suffering from imposter syndrome, and goes on discussing the diagnostic criteria that we might use. I thought there were a couple of different things that were great about the paper, so that's in the next on the next slide. I mean, usually I'm a contrarian and I like to criticize papers a lot. So here it's really not the case. So I just highlight the things that I thought were really great. I thought that Katherine made a lot of informative distinctions, which she ties really well to issues of social justice and really shows us why we should care about them. And I think that's really important work to be done in philosophy. So that's very nice. I also thought that it was really nice to see her distinguish between justification and truth, and also highlight that what constitutes justification is really not straightforward, and the importance of keeping in mind both truth and justifications as evaluative dimensions that are somewhat separate in many cases when assessing why a cognitive attitude that's trying to represent what the world is like might be mistaken. So I thought the paper showed a lot of humility and open-mindedness. Katherine considers a lot of the different kinds of options that there might be, even if she's herself more favorable to a broader conception of imposter syndrome that includes those justified but false imposter attitudes. I thought also that the wide potential therapeutic applications of a better conceptual understanding were really praiseworthy, and the wide scope of the ameliorative inquiry that she showed was really convincing, I think, as a sort of bonus that this kind of distinction making work would give us as an outcome. So on the next slide, I'm highlighting now a couple of, well, really just one thing that I would like to ask Katherine to tell us more about. And so those are, I think, related to Leonie's questions, but they're coming at it from a slightly different angle. So I'm also interested in exploring a little bit more the effective imposter attitudes that are at stake in imposter syndrome. But where I'm coming from is that I'm wondering really what is the relationship between those effective imposter attitudes and the doxastic attitudes that we raised. So Katherine highlights, when she describes the nature of imposter attitudes, that the central attitudes that people tend to discuss is beliefs in one's own adequacy, belief in one's own inadequacy, but that there are various other kinds of attitudes that might be involved, such as doubt, worry, fear, lack of belief in one's own adequacy. So this lack of belief I thought was quite interesting as well. And she focuses on the doxastic imposter attitudes and how they are justified, partly as a way to kind of streamline the discussion, which is always kind of helpful in a paper. But I'm curious to see how she would like to maybe expand on that if she had the opportunity of writing a little bit more about that. Because in several parts of the paper, Katherine suggests that these kind of contribute to one another, but doesn't tell us exactly how they are linked. So I want to know if we can really understand what justification a subject has for their doxastic imposter attitudes separately from their imposter feelings, and hear what Katherine would suggest here. So I, like I announced, have a sort of helpful suggestion. And so I am kind of skeptical that we can really fully separate those two things, that we can treat them independently of one another, but for different reasons, maybe than Leonie sort of suggested, at least implicitly. So the reason why I think we might struggle to fully separate the doxastic and effective elements of the attitudes is because a lot of the time when we assess our doxastic states, we tend to use things like epistemic feeling. So there's been a lot of research recently in cognitive sciences and in philosophy as well on metacognition and on the kinds of mechanisms that are in place for us to assess whether we know, for example, a specific proposition in certain ways. And so Joël Proust, who is in Paris at INS, has done quite a lot of work on that. And what I want to suggest is that it seems like actually the lack of belief in one's own adequacy or the belief in one's inadequacy are in fact exemplifying a broader cognitive adaptation and a tight relationship between the feelings of inadequacy that result from various epistemic feelings being present. So Katherine suggests a link between pragmatic encroachment and feelings, but she leaves it open how they might be linked. I think it seems actually like we might be wanting to make a stronger point and explore the relationship between the two. So in the paper, she recognizes an interesting point for standpoint epistemologists, which is that the disadvantaged person knows more about her situation. She actually has more information about it. She knows what's said to her and how she is treated. And yet what she knows makes it more difficult for her to know the truth about her own capabilities and achievements. Sorry, there's a typo, the bracket. But what this suggests to me is that the cases of imposter syndrome that are highlighted in the paper are cases in which there is a really high amount of information available to subjects who are suffering from imposter syndrome, but because they have high amount of conflicting information, they might have something like cognitive dissonance that leads to various epistemic feelings, such as diminished feelings of fluency. There are all sorts of studies suggesting that when we face conflicting information, we become less able to process, we feel less able to process the information that we're dealing with. And as a result, we slow down and don't form beliefs straight away, but withhold forming beliefs so as to search for more information that would enable us to be a little bit more certain before we form a belief. And I wonder whether those diminished feelings of fluency are typical, in fact, of imposter doxastic attitudes and the environments that they result from. So one thing that this suggests is that as a result of additional conflicting sources of information with respect to truth, because the subject doesn't really know how to parse what is true and what is not, given those different sources, those complex epistemic feelings are going to lead the subject to assess content, which is a candidate for belief with respect to more norms than just truth, with respect to several norms. So Joël Proust defends that several epistemic norms which do not have truth as their epistemic standards, such as coherence, plausibility, and relevance, can guide decisions when there is uncertainty. So that leads to a question about what kind of justification is involved in the justification that we have for imposter attitudes. And it seems that justification itself might involve different evaluative dimensions with respect to, for example, coherence, or with respect to plausibility. So I wonder if we might investigate what kinds of epistemic feelings are involved in different specific imposter attitudes, and how they tie to the beliefs or lack thereof which are formed, and whether that might also be informative of why and in what sense those attitudes are justified. So I'll stop here because I think I've gone on for long enough. And so the last slide just said, yes, thank you, Katherine, for a great paper and for a really nice talk. And thanks to Leonie as well.
Katherine, please.
Well, thanks. I mean, both comments, there's just so much in there. That's really great. And it's given me a lot to think about, and I won't try and address it all today. and I guess in different ways, you're kind of picking up the connections between the sort of effective attitudes and the doxastic attitudes. I guess one, perhaps I mean, I wanted to think about sort of two cases. So I've met people who will say things like, well, I know that I only got promoted because people like me. I'm not that good at my job, but I'm kind of nice and I show up and blah, blah, blah. And so they're kind of saying these things that sound like imposter syndrome. And yet they don't seem to feel bad about it. They've kind of reconciled themselves to it, maybe after time has passed. And so that I wanted to think about those people who've got these sort of imposter beliefs, but they don't have the imposter feelings, we might say. And then at the other end of the scale, I also wanted to think about the people who, where you might think it's almost like a phobia, right? So they really think that they are good enough, and yet they can't help feeling anxious about it and afraid and so on, even though they recognize that that's not, in some sense, not justified by their beliefs. And maybe it's too much to try and get both of those extremes under the same heading of imposter syndrome, but just to kind of, that's sort of explain how I got there. I love this idea of the epistemic feelings, that, you know, how that might affect how, you know, the affective stuff is going to affect how you form the beliefs, and in particular the fluency of forming beliefs. I think I'll have to look more at Chris' work and find out more about that. But thank you very much for that. I mean, just on Leonie, what you were saying, the idea about kind of belonging and fitting in. Again, I think that's a really rich idea to think about how it fits with the rest of imposter syndrome. I guess just one thing that struck me as you were speaking is that we might say, well, these people are right, but they don't fit in, right? They stand out, right? They don't just seem like all the other people. But that doesn't mean that they don't deserve to be there, or that they don't deserve to belong. And so maybe there's a kind of ambiguity in this notion of belonging, right? So I don't belong in the sense that I am different from these other people. I'm not normal for this situation, but it doesn't mean that I don't belong in that. It doesn't mean that I shouldn't be here or something like that. So maybe that would be a kind of thing to explore further, because you don't want to tell people that they should just ignore their differences from other people if there's, you know, that's part of their self-understanding, but you would hope that that wouldn't automatically convert into feeling that they've done something wrong, or for feeling that there's something to feel bad about that situation. But it may be hard to pull those things apart. There's much more I could say, but I think I'm just going to stop there, because I guess we want to have time as well for other people to ask questions.